What if the story of America's founding isn't the one you were told? Forget the Mayflower and Jamestown for just a moment. Before the 13 colonies, North America was a chaotic, high-stakes battleground for 4 other forgotten empires. This is rivals for a continent. It was a desperate race where the Spanish forged a brutal empire of God and gold from Florida to the west. The French built a vast inland dominion on rivers and fur, arming native allies. The Dutch, in a flash of genius, created the world's first global gateway, New Amsterdam. Even the Swedes launched their own Delaware experiment, leaving a surprising footprint. These were not neighbors. They were rivals who clashed in secret border wars and in the brutal, bloody Beaver Wars. They fought over gold, fur, and the very soul of the continent. This is the hidden history of how these forgotten empires left an indelible mark on the America you know. From the log cabin to the cowboy, from Wall Street to New Orleans, their legacy is hiding in plain sight. Welcome to the real story of how America was forged. Rivals for a continent. The forgotten empires that forged America. The race begins. Why Europe's empires bet everything on a new world. The world, as it was known in the mid-1400s, felt complete. It was a world centered on the glittering Mediterranean, a world where European kingdoms, still bearing the scars of the Black Death, looked inward or eastward with a mixture of fear and desire. For centuries, the arteries of wealth had flowed from one direction, the east. From China, India, and the Spice Islands, caravans snaked across deserts and steppes, bringing silk, porcelain, pepper, and cloves, goods so valuable they were worth their weight in gold. This entire system of wealth was built on a series of precarious connections, a fragile chain of merchants and middlemen stretching across the vast landmass of Asia. And in 1453, the central link in that chain was shattered. When the Ottoman Sultan, Mehmed the Conqueror, breached the ancient walls of Constantinople, he did more than just end the 1,000-year reign of the Byzantine Empire. He effectively seized the gateway between Europe and Asia. Almost overnight, the traditional land routes of the Silk Road were choked off, controlled by an empire hostile to the Christian kingdoms of the West. The flow of goods didn't stop entirely, but prices skyrocketed. What was once a river of commerce became a trickle, and every drop was taxed by a powerful new gatekeeper. In the royal courts of Lisbon, Seville, and Venice, a palpable panic set in. The economic lifeblood of Europe was being severed. They were cut off. A new route had to be found, not as a matter of exploration, but as a matter of economic and political survival. The race had begun. The first nation to make a decisive move was not a sprawling empire, but the small, rugged kingdom of Portugal. Perched on the western edge of Europe, the Portuguese were natural seafarers. Under the visionary guidance of Prince Henry the Navigator, they had been meticulously developing the tools for a new age. They engineered the caravel, a ship nimble enough to sail against the wind yet strong enough to withstand the open Atlantic. They gathered cartographers, astronomers, and shipbuilders, systematically pushing the boundaries of the known world. Their strategy was slow, patient, and brutal. They would not challenge the Ottomans. Instead, they would bypass them entirely by sailing south, down the uncharted coast of Africa, believing they could eventually round its tip and reach the Indies. For decades, their ships crept further and further, mapping the coastline, establishing trading posts, and tragically beginning the Atlantic slave trade. In 1488, Bartolomeo Diaz rounded the Cape of Good Hope, proving it was possible. A decade later, Vasco da Gama completed the journey, reaching India and returning with a cargo of spices that paid for the expedition 60 times over. Portugal had won the first leg of the race. securing a monopoly on the sea route to the east and becoming the richest kingdom in Europe. This staggering success sent a shockwave across the continent, nowhere more so than in neighboring Spain. Spain, newly unified under the Catholic monarchs Ferdinand and Isabella, had just completed the Reconquista, a 700-year campaign to expel the Moorish kingdoms from the Iberian Peninsula. They were a nation forged in war, filled with religious zeal, and now suddenly looking for their next grand project. They watched Portugal's growing wealth with unconcealed envy. They too were blocked by the Ottomans, and now their chief rival controlled the only known alternative route. They needed a shortcut. It was in this desperate, ambitious atmosphere that a persistent Genoese mariner named Christopher Columbus finally found a receptive audience. For years, Columbus had been rejected by the courts of Europe, including Portugal. His idea was simple, radical, and as it turned out, fantastically wrong. He proposed to reach the east by sailing west. The educated elite of the 15th century knew the world was round. The debate was not over the shape, but the size. The consensus, based on calculations dating back to ancient Greece, was that the ocean was far too vast to cross. Columbus, relying on flawed maps and his own wishful thinking, argued the world was much smaller, that Japan was only a few thousand miles west of Spain. Ferdinand and Isabella, with little to lose and an empire to gain, took the gamble. It was a high-risk speculative venture. In 1492, they funded his 3 small ships, not as an act of scientific curiosity, but as a desperate bid to leapfrog their rivals. When Columbus returned, he brought not the silks and spices of Asia, but strange plants, exotic birds, and a handful of captive Taino people. He died believing he had found the outskirts of Asia, but what he had truly done was stumble upon a barrier continent, an entire hemisphere whose existence was unknown to Europe. He had opened a door that could never be closed. The news of this new world ignited a firestorm. To prevent a war between its 2 most powerful Catholic states, the Pope, Alexander VI, intervened. In 1494, with the Treaty of Tordesillas, he literally drew a line on a map of the globe, dividing the undiscovered non-Christian world between Spain and Portugal. This single act formalized a staggering assumption that the entire planet was the property of Europe, theirs for the taking. This discovery, and the papal decree that carved it up, unleashed the 3 great forces that would propel the race for the next 3 centuries. Gold, glory, and God. Gold was the primary engine. The theories of mercantilism, the belief that there was a finite amount of wealth in the world and that a nation's power depended on securing as much of it as possible, dominated a monarch's thinking. A king needed gold to pay his armies, build his navies, and fund his power. When Hernán Cortés toppled the Aztec Empire and Francisco Pizarro crushed the Inca, the plunder they sent back to Spain was beyond imagination. Ships laden with silver from the mines of Potosi and gold from Peruvian temples filled the Spanish treasury. This created an intoxicating gold fever that spread across Europe. Every king, nobleman, and merchant dreamed of finding their own El Dorado. The New World was no longer a barrier. It was a treasure chest waiting to be unlocked. Glory was the fuel for the men who undertook these perilous journeys. This was the age of the Renaissance, a celebration of individual achievement. Explorers like Ferdinand Magellan, who first circumnavigated the globe, conquistadors like Cortés, and sea captains like Sir Francis Drake became the superstars of their day. Their names were printed in pamphlets, their exploits celebrated in song. For a king, glory meant empire. The size of your domain was a direct measure of your prestige. Claiming vast, unknown territories, even if you had no idea what was in them, became a matter of national pride and a way to intimidate your rivals. And finally, there was God. The race for a new world was inextricably linked with a battle for souls. Spain and Portugal, as the champions of Catholicism, saw it as their divine mandate to convert the heathen millions of the Americas. The cross was planted firmly alongside the flag. But soon, a new religious conflict in Europe would add a desperate urgency to this mission. When Martin Luther's protests in 1517 shattered the unity of the Church, Europe was plunged into the Protestant Reformation. Now, the contest was not just Catholic versus non-Christian, it was Catholic versus Protestant. Protestant England and the newly formed Dutch Republic saw colonization as a way to save the indigenous peoples from the tyranny of Spanish Catholicism. For their part, Catholic France and Spain redoubled their missionary efforts, seeing a Protestant heretic as a threat as dangerous as any other. This religious rivalry provided a powerful moral justification for conquest, cloaking brutal actions in the righteous robes of divine will. For the first century, the race was dominated by Spain. But the other powers of Europe, now recovering from their own internal conflicts, were not idle. France, consumed by its own religious wars, was slow to colonize but quick to explore. Men like Jacques Cartier pushed deep into the St. Lawrence River, searching not for cities of gold, but for a northwest passage, a hypothetical river that would cut through the continent and finally provide the shortcut to Asia that Columbus had sought. They found no passage, but they found something almost as valuable: fur. England, a minor island nation, spent the 16th century dealing with its own religious turmoil under Henry VIII and his children. Their early attempts, like the lost colony of Roanoke, were failures. They were more focused on raiding the Spanish Empire than building their own, sending sea dogs like Sir Francis Drake to plunder Spanish galleons. It was not until their shocking defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588 that England gained the confidence to challenge Spain and plant its own permanent, struggling colonies. And then there were the Dutch. At the beginning of this race, they were not even a country. They were a possession, a tiny, rebellious province of the Spanish Empire. But they were a nation of merchants, shipbuilders, and bankers. After fighting a brutal, decades-long war for independence, they emerged in the early 1600s as the most dynamic economic power on Earth. They were not driven by the quest for gold, glory, or God. They were driven by business. Their goal was to create a global trade network. And they would build a commercial hub, New Amsterdam, right in the heart of the New World. By the early 1600s, the race had entered a new, chaotic, and dangerous phase. The bet was no longer if European empires should risk everything on this new world. The staggering riches of Spain proved the gamble had paid off. The new question was how to muscle in on the prize. The stage was set. In the south, the monolithic Spanish Empire. In the north, the sprawling French fur trading network. Along the coast, the first fragile English settlements. And sailing into the harbor between them, the pragmatic, profit-minded ships of the Dutch. The forgotten empires were about to collide, and in their struggle, they would forge the foundations of a new continent. The Spanish Foundation, building an empire of God and gold from Florida to the west. In the wake of Columbus's voyage, Spain did not just step into the New World, it lunged. As the first European power to grasp the sheer world-altering scale of what had been discovered, Spain set the template for all who would follow. It was a template forged in the crucible of the 700-year Reconquista, their own centuries-long war to reclaim the Iberian Peninsula from the Moors. This campaign had fused the Spanish identity into a potent, volatile compound of militant Catholicism, warrior culture, and a desperate hunger for land and wealth. Now, this formidable machinery was aimed at a new hemisphere. The Spanish model of conquest was a unique and ruthless form of venture capitalism. The Crown did not fund massive state-run expeditions. Instead, it licensed them. Ambitious, often minor noblemen, the conquistadors, were granted permission to explore and conquer. They raised their own private armies, mortgaged their estates, and took on massive personal risk, all for a chance at a legendary prize. In return, the Spanish crown would receive its quinto real, the royal fifth, or 20% of all treasure found, and of course, title to the land and all the souls living on it. This system privatized the risk while socializing the reward, unleashing a wave of fiercely motivated, lethally experienced, and profoundly ruthless men upon the Americas. In the South, this model produced astonishing success. Hernán Cortés toppled the Aztec Empire in 1521, and Francisco Pizarro crushed the Inca in 1533. The gold and silver that flowed from Mexico and Peru flooded the Spanish treasury, making Spain the wealthiest and most powerful nation on earth. This spectacular plunder created a gold fever that defined the first century of Spanish exploration. Surely, they believed, the vast northern continent held its own El Dorado. This quest for a second Aztec empire, a new Peru, is what drove the first Spanish incursions into the lands that would become the United States. And it was a quest defined by spectacular, brutal failure. The first attempt was by Juan Ponce de Leon, who had sailed with Columbus. Lured by rumors of not just gold but a mythical fountain of youth, he landed on a lush, flowering coast in 1513. He named it La Florida, or Place of Flowers, and claimed it for Spain. He found no fountain and no gold. Instead, he found fierce resistance from the Calusa people, and on a second expedition years later, a poison-tipped arrow that ended his life. The failure was a prelude. In 1528, Panfilo de Narvaez led a disastrous expedition of 300 men into Florida, where they were promptly separated from their ships. Plagued by disease, starvation, and constant indigenous attacks, the expedition dissolved. The survivors, in a desperate feat of engineering, built 5 flimsy barges and tried to sail the Gulf Coast to Mexico. A storm wrecked them on the coast of modern-day Texas. Only 4 men survived the subsequent 8-year ordeal. One of them, Alvar Núñez Cabeza de Vaca, walked thousands of miles across the American Southwest, living among various native tribes. When he finally, miraculously, stumbled back into Spanish territory in 1536, his report electrified the empire. He had seen no gold, but he repeated rumors he had heard, tales of vast, wealthy 7 cities of Cibola to the north. These rumors launched the 2 greatest Spanish expeditions into North America. First, in 1539, Hernando de Soto, a hardened veteran of Pizarro's conquest in Peru, plowed into Florida. He led a massive armored force of over 600 soldiers, cavalry, and priests on a brutal 4-year march through the southeast. De Soto was not an explorer. He was a plunderer. He found no cities of gold, only populous agrarian societies. His method was to march into a village, kidnap its chief, demand gold and food, and move on, leaving a trail of slaughter, disease, and terror. He was the first European to see the Mississippi River, but it was no comfort. He died of a fever on its banks in 1542, and his men, defeated, built boats and sailed downriver to Mexico. At the exact same time, Francisco Vázquez de Coronado was marching north from Mexico, chasing the same rumors as De Soto. He was searching for the 7 cities of Cibola. When he found them in 1540, Cibola turned out to be the modest adobe pueblos of the Zuni people in New Mexico. There was no gold. Furious and disappointed, Coronado and his men treated the Pueblo people with devastating cruelty. Lured on by a captive guide who promised a rich land called Quivira, Coronado marched his army across the Texas Panhandle and onto the Great Plains, reaching as far as modern-day Kansas. He found no gold-plated cities, only the buffalo hide-covered villages of the Wichita people. A bitterly disillusioned Coronado returned to Mexico, his expedition a total financial ruin. By the 1560s, the Spanish crown had learned a hard lesson. North America, it seemed, held no treasure. The conquistador model had failed. For decades, Florida and the West were dismissed as worthless. So why stay? The motive shifted permanently from plunder to protection. Spain's real empire was in the south. The treasure fleets, heavy with Mexican and Peruvian silver, sailed from Havana, up the Gulf Stream, and past the coast of Florida on their way back to Spain. This predictable route made them a prime target. For Spain, Florida was no longer a potential gold mine. It was a vital defensive buffer, a military outpost needed to protect its wealth from its fast-rising rivals. The immediate threat came from the French. In 1564, a group of French Protestants, or Huguenots, established Fort Caroline near modern-day Jacksonville, Florida, smack on the route of the treasure fleet. This was an intolerable act of aggression and heresy. King Philip II dispatched his most ruthless admiral, Pedro Menendez de Aviles, with a simple order: remove the French. In 1565, Menendez landed and established a military base he named St. Augustine. He then marched his men overland in a hurricane, surprised the French, and captured Fort Caroline. He systematically executed nearly all of his captives, not, as he reportedly said, as to Frenchmen, but as to Lutherans. St. Augustine, founded in 1565, became the first permanent, continuously occupied European settlement in the future United States. It was not a town of pilgrims or merchants. It was a presidio, a military fortress, a tiny remote garrison of soldiers paid by the king to guard the sea lanes. This was the true Spanish foundation, not a colony of settlers but a fortress of soldiers. While the presidio anchored the empire, the second pillar of this new foundation was the mission, or mission. If gold could not be extracted from the land, souls would be extracted for God. This dual-purpose institution, led by Franciscan friars, was designed to pacify and control the indigenous populations. The goal was to convert them to Catholicism, civilize them into Spanish-speaking subjects, and use their labor to support the colony. A vast, fragile chain of missions was established, stretching up the coast of Florida and Georgia and most notably into the west. This second great bastion of Spanish power was in New Mexico. Even though Coronado had found no gold, Franciscan missionaries pushed back into the territory. In 1598, Don Juan de Oñate led a formal colonizing expedition up the Rio Grande. He was not looking for treasure. He was establishing a kingdom. He brought hundreds of settlers, families, and thousands of livestock. But Oñate met the same resistance as his predecessors. When the Acoma Pueblo people resisted, Oñate ordered a horrific example to be made. After a brutal 3-day battle, his soldiers killed hundreds, and Oñate sentenced the surviving men to have one foot cut off. In 1610, the Spanish established Santa Fe as the capital of this remote, high-desert province. Here, the Spanish foundation was built on two institutions: the encomienda, a system of forced tribute and labor demanded from the Pueblo people, and the mission, which violently suppressed native religion. For 80 years, the Spanish attempted to build their empire of God and gold, now interpreted as God and labor, on the backs of the Pueblo. They built adobe churches in every village, but underneath resentment simmered. In 1680, that resentment exploded. In one of the most successful indigenous uprisings in history, The Pueblo Revolt, a religious leader named Pope, united the scattered Pueblo villages. In a coordinated attack, they killed over 400 Spanish settlers and 21 of the 33 Franciscan friars. They drove the remaining Spaniards completely out of New Mexico, all the way back to El Paso. For 12 years, the Pueblo people ruled themselves, systematically destroying every vestige of the Spanish Empire. The Spanish eventually returned, the Reconquista of 1692, but they had learned a lesson. They returned with a lighter touch, abolishing the encomienda system and allowing for more religious coexistence. This was the Spanish foundation. It was an empire built not on the hoped-for gold, but on the strategic placement of the Presidio and the Mission. It stretched from the humid coasts of St. Augustine to the high deserts of Santa Fe. It was vast, but it was also hollow, a thin, brittle frontier populated by soldiers and friars, not a tide of settlers. It had left an indelible mark, in language, religion, law, and architecture, but it was a foundation built on coercion, and it was about to be challenged by new rivals who had learned from Spain's successes and its failures. The French design, how the fur trade and river routes created a vast inland empire, while Spain built its empire on the foundations of conquest and coercion, chasing the spectral glint of gold across the deserts of the Southwest. France was quietly designing a different kind of dominion. Its empire would not be built on plundering cities of gold, but on the pursuit of a different, softer, and far more renewable treasure. It would not be an empire of fortified towns, but a vast network of water. The French were late to the game, delayed by their own bloody religious wars. But like all others, their first motive was a familiar one, a shortcut to Asia. In 1534, Jacques Cartier sailed into the wide, cold mouth of a mighty river. He was searching for the Northwest Passage, the fabled sea route to China. What he found instead was the St. Lawrence River, the great artery that led into the heart of the continent. He met the Iroquoian people, traded with them, and famously misunderstood their word for village, Kanata, as the name for the entire land. He had just discovered Canada. Cartier found no passage, no gold, no silks. What he found was a land of harsh winters and, from his perspective, little immediate value. He returned to France with a few kidnapped indigenous leaders and fool's gold. For the rest of the 16th century, France, consumed by its own internal turmoil, left North America largely to its fishermen. It was not until the early 1600s that the French returned with a new, more focused purpose. The man who embodied this vision was Samuel de Champlain, a soldier, navigator, and cartographer who, unlike the Spanish conquistadors, was a pragmatic visionary. When he founded Quebec in 1608 on a high cliff commanding the St. Lawrence, he wasn't building a gold-hunting outpost. He was building a trading post. Champlain had realized what Cartier had missed. The true wealth of this new land was not in its soil, but in its forests. Specifically in the beaver. In Europe, a fashion craze was raging. The beaver felt hat, durable, waterproof, and stylish, was the absolute peak of high fashion. Decades of overhunting had nearly exterminated the beaver in Europe, but the forests of North America were teeming with them. This single fashion trend became the economic engine of New France. This simple economic fact dictated an entirely different model of colonization. You cannot mine for fur. You cannot force a subjugated population to farm it. It must be trapped, processed, and traded. And the French, newcomers in a harsh land, were terrible at it. The Algonquin, the Huron, the Montagnais, they were the masters. Spain wanted labor and tribute. France wanted partners and suppliers. This was the French design. An empire built not on subjugation, but on alliance. To get the fur, the French needed the cooperation of the indigenous nations. To get that cooperation, they had to offer something in return. They offered European goods: metal knives, iron kettles, wool blankets, and most importantly, guns. Champlain understood this from the start. In 1609, just a year after founding Quebec, he made a decision that would shape the continent for 150 years. He joined his new trading partners, the Huron and Algonquin, in a raid against their mortal enemies, the Iroquois Confederacy. On the shores of what is now Lake Champlain, a new kind of warfare was introduced. When Champlain fired his arquebus, the Iroquois, who had never seen a firearm, broke and fled in terror. With that single shot, Champlain cemented the most important economic and military alliance in North American history. The French had secured their access to the vast interior fur trade, but they had also, in that same moment, earned the undying enmity of the Iroquois, the most powerful and organized indigenous confederacy on the continent. This single act would have profound consequences, as the Iroquois would later ally with France's greatest rivals, the Dutch and the English. This alliance-based model created a new kind of imperial agent. While Spain had its conquistadors and friars, France had the coureurs de bois, the runners of the woods. These were not soldiers. They were young, hardy Frenchmen who left the thin strip of civilization on the St. Lawrence and paddled their birch-bark canoes thousands of miles into the upper country, or Pays d'en-Haut. They were part explorer, part trader, and part diplomat. They did not conquer the wilderness. They adapted to it. They lived among their indigenous allies for months or years at a time, learned their languages, ate their food, and wore their clothing. Crucially, they formed relationships. They married indigenous women, creating new Métis, mixed-race communities, and kinship ties that bound the empire together. This intimate integration was the glue of New France. It was a stark contrast to the rigid, segregationist Spanish presidios, or the self-contained English villages that would soon appear on the coast. The French design was thus defined by its geography. Its highways were not roads, but the continent's vast interlocking system of rivers and lakes. The St. Lawrence led to the Great Lakes. The Great Lakes led to countless rivers, the Ohio, the Illinois, the Wisconsin, that all seemed to hint at an even greater prize, a great river, the Mississippi, that was rumored to flow south to a warm sea. If this river could be controlled, France would have a back door into the continent. In 1673, a Jesuit priest named Jacques Marquette and an explorer named Louis Joliet set out from modern-day Wisconsin. They paddled down the Mississippi, past the mouth of the Missouri and the Ohio, far enough to confirm that it flowed not to the Pacific, but south to the Gulf of Mexico, the heart of Spanish-claimed territory. It was one of their successors, René Robert Cavelier, Sieur de la Salle, who grasped the full geopolitical implications. La Salle was a man of towering ambition and profound personal flaws, a restless aristocrat who dreamed on a continental scale. In 1682, after years of setbacks, he led an expedition all the way from the Illinois country to the mouth of the Mississippi River. There, on the muddy delta, in a landscape completely alien to his native France, La Salle performed one of the most audacious acts in imperial history. He planted a column, raised a banner, and in a flat formal ceremony, claimed the entire river basin for his king, Louis XIV. He named this impossibly vast territory Louisiana. This claim was, on its face, absurd. With a few dozen men in canoes, La Salle had just claimed everything from the Rocky Mountains to the Appalachians, from the Great Lakes to the Gulf. It was an area that dwarfed France itself. and it was a direct existential challenge to both of their rivals. To the east, this French crescent formed a barrier, a containment line meant to hem the English colonies into their narrow settlements along the Atlantic coast. To the south, it was a dagger pointed straight at the heart of the Spanish Empire. La Salle's claim to the Gulf Coast was a direct threat to Spanish Florida, and more importantly, to the silver mines of Mexico. Spain, which had ignored the northern Gulf Coast, suddenly scrambled to defend it. La Salle's subsequent disastrous attempt to found a colony in Texas, where he missed the Mississippi, landed on the Texas coast, and was eventually murdered by his own men, was a failure. But it set off a panic in the Spanish court. It was this French threat, not any desire for the land itself, that directly spurred Spain to establish new missions and presidios in East Texas, creating a new line of conflict. And so the French design was complete. It was a vast, sprawling inland empire, but it was in many ways a hollow empire. On a map, New France covered more than half the continent. On the ground, it was little more than a thin, brittle network of missions, trading posts, and rickety forts, connected by thousands of miles of water. In 1700, the English colonies on the coast had a population of over 250,000. New France had fewer than 20,000. This was its fundamental weakness. It was an empire of influence rather than an empire of settlement. It was built on the canoe and the beaver pelt, on personal relationships and strategic alliances. It was a brilliant, adaptive, and efficient way to control a continent with minimal manpower. But it was about to be tested by rivals who had different designs. The Dutch, with their focus on pure commerce, and the English, with their unstoppable, unquenchable thirst for land. The rivers that had been France's highway to an empire would soon become the battleground for its survival. The Dutch Gateway, the rise of New Amsterdam as the world's trading post. In the early 17th century, a new power rose from the wetlands of Europe. It was not a grand ancient monarchy like Spain or France. It was a small defiant republic, forged in an 80-year all-out war for independence against the Spanish crown. This was the Netherlands. The Dutch were not warriors in the Spanish conquistador mold, nor were they explorers in the French coureur des bois tradition. They were, first and foremost, merchants. They were the world's bankers, its shippers, and its most ruthless traders. In 1602, they had created a revolutionary new entity, the Dutch East India Company, VOC, the world's first multinational corporation, armed with the power to build forts, wage war, and sign treaties. They had built a global empire of profit, stretching from the Spice Islands of Indonesia to the coast of Brazil. Their focus was not God nor glory. It was commerce. Like all other European powers, they were obsessed with finding a shortcut to the riches of Asia. In 1609, the VOC hired an English sea captain, Henry Hudson, to find the fabled Northwest Passage. Sailing his ship, the Half Man, Half Moon, Hudson explored the North American coast. He failed to find a route to China, but he did sail up a magnificent, deep, and promising river, one that would later bear his name. Hudson found two things on his journey. First, he found a perfect, sheltered, deep-water harbor, arguably the finest natural port on the entire continent. Second, he found the local Lenape people eager to trade, not gold or spices, but furs, specifically beaver pelts. For the Dutch, this was an immediate opportunity. Here was the same economic engine that was fueling New France, but with a crucial geographic advantage. This harbor and river system was south of the frozen St. Lawrence, accessible year-round. It was a direct gateway into the fur-rich interior. In 1621, the Dutch government chartered a new company, the Dutch West India Company, WIC. Its mandate was simple: to make money in the Atlantic world and in the process to attack and disrupt the trade of their great enemy Spain. The New World, for the WIC, was not a place to build a new society. It was a place to set up a new branch office. In 1624, the WIC established its first permanent outpost. It was not, however, on the harbor. It was 150 miles upriver, at a key strategic choke point. They called it Fort Orange, on the site of modern-day Albany. This was a calculated business decision. Fort Orange was placed at the intersection of the Hudson and Mohawk rivers, the very crossroads of the indigenous trade routes. It was a direct tap into the fur trade, an attempt to siphon it away from the French in the north. Only after securing the source of the wealth did the Dutch turn to securing the gateway. In 1626, the WIC's new Director General, Peter Minuit, landed on the large wooded island at the mouth of the river. The island, called Mannahatta by the Lenape, was the perfect location for a company headquarters. Minuit then proceeded to execute one of the most famous and misunderstood transactions in history. He purchased Manhattan Island from the local Lenape for a cache of trade goods, kettles, axes, cloth, and beads valued at 60 guilders. This was not a modern real estate deal. For the Dutch, it was a legalistic commercial contract, a way to secure a title deed for their investors back in Amsterdam. For the Lenape, who had no concept of private, permanent land ownership, they were likely agreeing to share the land, to grant the Dutch usage rights in exchange for gifts and an alliance. Regardless of the misunderstanding, the deal was done. The Dutch built a crude fort and a small settlement, which they named New Amsterdam. This was not a colony in the English or Spanish sense. It was a company town. Its sole purpose was profit, and the Dutch model of profit was ruthless and efficient. Unlike the French, who had to painstakingly integrate, travel deep inland, and form intimate kinship ties, the Dutch let their allies do the work. From Fort Orange, the Dutch established a monumental alliance with the Iroquois Confederacy. This was a purely commercial partnership, and it would change the face of the continent. The Dutch provided the Iroquois with something the French were hesitant to trade: firearms. Lots of them. In exchange for a tide of beaver and deer skins, the Dutch armed the Iroquois to the teeth. This alliance supercharged the Iroquois. Acting as the Dutch-backed middlemen, they launched the devastating Beaver Wars, a multi-decade campaign to monopolize the fur trade. They used their Dutch guns to attack and scatter France's allies, including the Huron, driving them from their ancestral lands. The fur that had once flowed to Quebec was now rerouted, flowing south down the Hudson River to the warehouses of New Amsterdam. The town itself was a direct reflection of its commercial soul. The WIC found it almost impossible to convince its own citizens to leave the prosperous, tolerant, and safe Netherlands for a raw, dangerous frontier outpost. Life was simply too good back home. Since they couldn't attract Dutchmen, the WIC, desperate for labor, opened the port to everyone. The result was the first and most chaotic multicultural society in North America. New Amsterdam became a magnet for the displaced, the ambitious, and the persecuted: French Huguenots, English dissenters, Germans, Finns, Swedes, and the first significant Jewish community in North America. Arriving in 1654, all sought refuge and opportunity in the Dutch gateway. By the 1640s, it was said that over 18 languages could be heard in the streets of the tiny, muddy settlement. This was not a utopia of tolerance. It was a pragmatic pluralism, born of a desperate need for manpower. The company didn't care about your religion, your culture, or your language. It cared if you could work, trade, and help the bottom line. This pragmatism was personified by its most famous governor, the fiery, peg-legged, and deeply authoritarian Peter Stuyvesant. Stuyvesant was a staunch Calvinist who was appalled by the rabble he governed. He tried to ban Lutherans from worshiping. He tried to deny entry to the 23 Jewish refugees who arrived from Brazil. In a moment that defined the character of the colony, the W.I.C. directors back in Amsterdam, who included some of those same Jewish refugees as major shareholders, overruled him. They wrote Stuyvesant a sharp letter, reminding him that the company's profits depended on immigration. Business once again trumped bigotry. This commercial ethos had a dark side. The WIC was one of the largest slave trading companies in the world. In 1626, the same year Manhattan was purchased, the first enslaved Africans arrived. They were not treated as property for life, as in the later English system, but as company slaves. They had some rights, such as the ability to marry and own property, and many eventually secured a half-freedom. But they were the forced labor that built the wall, that became Wall Street, cleared the land and served the company's interests. This entire, sprawling, chaotic global enterprise, the Iroquois alliance, the fur trade, the multicultural port, the enslaved labor, was perched precariously between its rivals. To the north were the English in New England. To the south were the English in Virginia and Maryland. And most immediately, to the west on the Delaware River, was a small, rival fur trading colony called New Sweden. The Dutch Gateway was a revolutionary concept, a colony built not on a shared creed or a single king, but on the simple, powerful idea of a free port. It was a place where anyone could come and try to make a buck. It was disorderly, dirty, and dangerous. But in its pragmatic pluralism and its singular focus on the deal, New Amsterdam was planting the seeds of the city it would one day become. It was the first true gateway to the world's market, and its very success made it a target. The Dutch, in their quest for profit, had built a prize too valuable for their rivals to ignore. The Delaware experiment, the brief but lasting footprint of New Sweden. By the 1630s, the race for the New World had drawn its major players. The Spanish held the South, a vast fortress-like empire of God and gold. The French commanded the North, their fur trading network a vast web of rivers and alliances. And at the very center, the Dutch had built a commercial gateway, New Amsterdam, a boisterous, multicultural engine of profit. These were the giants, the rivals who were beginning to circle each other. But the 17th century was an age of bold ambition, and the lure of American riches was intoxicating. It was an age when even a smaller rising power could look at the map, find a gap, and decide to roll the dice. And in 1637, the gaze of a new empire, the Kingdom of Sweden, fell upon the one part of the coast the others had claimed but not yet controlled, the Delaware River Valley. This was not a rash decision. Sweden was, at this moment, a European superpower. Its armies, under the legendary King Gustavus Adolphus, were a dominant force in the brutal 30 Years' War. Now, its leadership, looking for a way to fund this military machine, wanted to join the great game of global colonization. They wanted their own share of the two commodities that were proving more reliable than gold, tobacco and fur. They had a plan. And more importantly, they had a secret weapon, a man named Peter Minuit. If that name sounds familiar, it should. Minuit was the brilliant, disgruntled former director of the Dutch West India Company. He was the man who had bought Manhattan Island, who had built New Amsterdam from a muddy outpost into a thriving port. He was also the man who, after a dispute with the company's directors, had been unceremoniously fired. Now Minuit, with his intimate knowledge of the Dutch operation, offered his services to the Swedes. He knew the Dutch claims were a house of cards, a vast territory on paper, but in reality, only a few fortified posts on the Hudson River. He knew the Dutch had no real presence on the Delaware River, which they called the South River, and he knew, from his time in America, that the indigenous Susquehannock people, who controlled the fur trade in that region, were desperate for a European partner other than the allies of their mortal enemies, the Iroquois. Minuit's plan was a brilliant act of commercial sabotage. He would not challenge the Dutch on the Hudson. He would undercut them. He would plant a Swedish trading post on the Delaware, intercepting the flow of rich beaver pelts before they ever got near the Hudson River and the Dutch post at Fort Orange. In 1638, Minuit sailed 2 ships, the Kalmar Nickel and the Fogel Grip, into the mouth of the Delaware River. He passed the empty Dutch claims and landed on a rocky outcropping on a tributary. He met with the local Lenape chiefs and, in a ceremony he had perfected in Manhattan, executed a formal purchase of the land. He then began construction of a fort, which he named Fort Christina, in honor of Sweden's 12-year-old queen. The Delaware experiment had begun. It was from the start a different kind of colony. New Amsterdam was a boisterous, diverse urban port. New France was a far-flung network of priests and traders. New Sweden was something else entirely, a quiet, focused corporate venture. Its population was tiny, at times numbering only a few hundred people. It was not a grand imperial project. It was a business, and its business was fur. Fort Christina gave the Swedes exclusive access to the Susquehannock, who eagerly traded vast quantities of beaver pelts for Swedish guns, tools, and cloth. The experiment was an immediate, if small-scale, success, but the colony's most significant contribution was not in its ledger books. It was in the hands of its people. The Kingdom of Sweden at this time was a large empire, and it included the territory of modern-day Finland. Many of the Swedish settlers recruited by the company were, in fact, Finns from the heavily forested interior. They were pioneer families, woodsmen of the highest order, and they brought with them a piece of technology that would, quite literally, build America, the log cabin. The English on the coast built timber frame houses, a complex and slow method. The Dutch built with brick. But the Finns came from a land of endless trees and harsh winters. They had perfected a style of construction that required little more than an axe in the forest itself. They felled trees, cut saddle or dovetail notches at the ends, and stacked them horizontally, interlocking the corners. The gaps were chinked with moss or clay. It was a structure that could be built by a single family, using only the materials at hand, in a matter of weeks. It was fast, efficient, and incredibly sturdy, perfectly adapted to the raw forested frontier. In the woods of Delaware, the Finns built their simple, rugged log homes, unaware they were planting the seed of a future American icon. For over a decade, the Delaware experiment survived in a state of precarious balance. The Dutch in New Amsterdam were, to put it mildly, furious. Peter Stuyvesant, the peg-legged authoritarian governor, viewed the Swedish colony as a thorn in the side of New Netherland. He wrote apoplectic letters to his bosses in Amsterdam, demanding permission to wipe it out. But the Dutch West India Company, ever pragmatic, held him back. The Netherlands and Sweden were allies in the wars in Europe, and the company didn't want a colonial squabble to escalate. Instead, the Dutch played a game of Cold War on the Delaware. In 1651, Stuyvesant sailed down with a fleet and built Fort Casimir just south of Fort Christina, attempting to cut the Swedes off from the sea. The two tiny, rival outposts glared at each other for 4 years, their soldiers drinking in the same taverns, their traders competing for the same pelts. The situation was absurd, and it could not last. The end came not from the Dutch, but from the Swedes themselves. In 1654, a new ambitious Swedish governor named Johan Riesing arrived. He saw the Dutch fort as an insult. In a bold and foolish move, he captured Fort Casimir on Trinity Sunday, renaming it Fort Trafaldiget, Fort Trinity. He had overplayed his hand. He had given Peter Stuyvesant the casus belli he had been dreaming of. In the summer of 1655, Stuyvesant received his permission from the WIC. He assembled the largest military force ever seen in North America, 7 warships, a fleet of transport ships, and over 300 soldiers. This was not a warning. It was an armada. Stuyvesant sailed his fleet into the Delaware, captured the formerly Dutch Fort Trinity, and then parked his entire navy directly in front of Fort Christina, pointing his cannons at the walls. He demanded immediate and unconditional surrender. Governor Rising, with his tiny garrison of barely 30 men, had no choice. On September 15, 1655, without a single shot being fired, New Sweden ceased to exist. The 17-year Delaware experiment was over. The colony was absorbed in its entirety into New Netherland. But here the story takes its most important turn, revealing the lasting footprint. The colony was gone, but the colonists were not. The Dutch, in their usual pragmatic fashion, had no interest in a mass expulsion. They just wanted the problem solved. They offered the Swedish and Finnish settlers a simple deal. Swear an oath of loyalty to the Dutch Republic, and you can keep your farms, your churches, your local courts, and your language. The settlers, with little allegiance to a distant king who had failed to protect them, overwhelmingly accepted, and so they stayed. They continued to work their farms, raise their families, and, crucially, build their log cabins. Just 9 years later, in 1664, the English would sail into New York Harbor and do to Peter Stuyvesant what he had done to the Swedes, conquering New Netherland in another bloodless takeover. The English, now in control of the Delaware, found an established, thriving population of non-English settlers, and as new waves of immigrants began to arrive, Scots, Irish, Germans, and others, they pushed past the coast and into the great, dark forests of the Pennsylvania frontier. When they got there, they did not build the thatched cottages of England or the brick townhouses of the Netherlands. They built the only structure that made sense. They copied the fast, simple, and rugged design they saw all along the Delaware. They built the log cabin. This was the lasting footprint of New Sweden. Its political life was a brief flash, a tiny footnote in the grand story of rival empires. But its cultural contribution became the physical symbol of the entire American frontier. The log cabin, the home of the pioneer, the settler, and, in the mythology of the new nation, the humble birthplace of presidents like Abraham Lincoln, was not an English or a Dutch design. It was the enduring, anonymous gift of the forgotten Finnish woodsman and the short-lived Delaware experiment. The first conquest, how the Dutch forcibly ended the Swedish-American dream. In the raw, sprawling wilderness of 17th century North America, European empires were not neighbors. They were competitors in a zero-sum game. The lines on their maps, drawn in the warm, comfortable studies of kings and ministers back in Europe, were nothing more than hopeful fictions. On the ground, an empire's claim was only as strong as the forts it could build, the trade it could control, and ultimately, the force it could project. By 1654, a silent, simmering conflict had been brewing for over a decade. It was a Cold War fought not with armies, but with trading posts and ledger books centered on the rich, strategic corridor of the Delaware River, a region the Dutch called the South River. On one side was the established, commercially driven Dutch colony of New Netherland, its heart in New Amsterdam. On the other was the small but tenacious upstart New Sweden, centered at Fort Christina. The Dutch claim was older, but the Swedish presence was a constant, irritating success. The Swedes, particularly through their Finnish settlers, had fostered better relationships with the Susquehannock people. They were siphoning off the most valuable beaver pelts, intercepting the flow of fur that the Dutch West India Company, WIC, felt was rightfully theirs. For the governor of New Netherland, this was an intolerable situation. His name was Peter Stuyvesant. Stuyvesant was a man who embodied the stern, unyielding will of the Dutch Republic. A former soldier, he had lost his right leg to a cannonball in the Caribbean, and his rigid, autocratic style was as famous as the wooden peg that replaced his limb. He was a devout, humorless company man, and he viewed the Swedes on the Delaware not as rivals, but as trespassers. They were a thorn in the side of his colony, and for years he had been begging his superiors in Amsterdam for permission to do one simple thing: remove them. For years, the WIC had held him back. The Netherlands and Sweden were Protestant allies in the complex religious wars of Europe. A colonial squabble, they argued, was not worth jeopardizing a continental alliance. Instead, Stuyvesant had tried a different tactic. In 1651, he personally led a small fleet to the Delaware. He did not attack Fort Christina. He did something more clever and more suffocating. He sailed just south of the Swedish fort and built a new Dutch outpost, Fort Casimir, on a key piece of high ground. It was a strategic masterstroke, a choke point designed to cut the Swedes off from the sea, monitor their trade, and slowly choke the life out of their colony. For 4 years, this absurd tense standoff defined the Delaware. Two tiny European forts occupied by a handful of soldiers glared at each other across the river, competing for the same trade in a land that belonged to neither of them. Then, in May 1654, the situation exploded. A new, ambitious governor, Johan Riesing, arrived from Sweden to take command of the colony. Riesing had been instructed to be firm, but he was also proud. He saw the Dutch fort as a profound, illegal insult. Believing Stuyvesant was weak and the WIC distracted, he decided to make a statement. On Trinity Sunday, Riesing sailed to Fort Casimir. The Dutch garrison was completely unprepared, with its commander away and its powder wet. Riesing captured the fort without firing a single shot. He took possession, strengthened its walls, and triumphantly renamed it Fort Trafalgar, or Fort Trinity. It was a fatal miscalculation. When news of the fort's fall reached New Amsterdam, Peter Stuyvesant was consumed with a righteous fury. This was not just a commercial dispute anymore. It was an act of war, a direct assault on the honor of the Dutch Republic. He fired off a blistering report to the WIC, and this time, he got the answer he had been dreaming of. The political landscape in Europe had changed. The Great Wars were over. Sweden was no longer a vital ally. The WIC, incensed by the loss of their fort and the insolent behavior of the Swedes, gave Stuyvesant his carte blanche. The order was simple: drive the Swedes from the river. Stuyvesant did not rush. A good soldier, he spent the next year meticulously preparing for total war. He was not planning a raid. He was planning an invasion. He levied a special tax on the citizens of New Amsterdam, called up the militia, repaired his ships, and gathered every soldier, sailor, and cannon he could muster. In the last week of August 1655, the largest military force ever assembled in North America gathered in the harbor of New Amsterdam. It was an armada designed for absolute, overwhelming shock and awe. The fleet consisted of 7 warships, led by the 36-gun flagship De Waag, the Scales, along with over a dozen smaller transport vessels. On board were at least 300 and perhaps as many as 600 professional soldiers and citizen militia, the entire population of New Sweden, men, Women and children was barely 400 people. Governor Riesing had perhaps 30 or 40 trained soldiers under his command. The Swedish-American dream, which had begun as a quiet, hopeful experiment 17 years earlier, was about to be extinguished by force. The fleet sailed down the coast and on the 1st of September, entered the Delaware Bay. The Swedish and Finnish settlers on their small, isolated farms could only watch in terror as this massive, dark fleet sailed past, the Dutch flags snapping in the wind. The Armada did not sail directly for the Swedish capital at Fort Christina. Its first target was the stolen fort, Fort Trafaldigat. Stuyvesant's soldiers landed, set up artillery, and surrounded the fort. The Swedish commander, seeing the hopeless odds, surrendered almost immediately. The Dutch flag was raised once more over the post, which Stuyvesant promptly renamed Fort Casimir. With his forward base secured, Stuyvesant turned his attention to the final target. He moved his entire fleet upriver and anchored it directly in front of Fort Christina, parking the Dewag so close that its cannons, loaded with grape shot, were pointed directly at the small, aging wooden ramparts. His soldiers landed, seizing the high ground, surrounding the fort on all sides and cutting off any hope of escape. From his flagship, Stuyvesant sent a simple message to Governor Riesing: surrender. Inside the fort, the situation was desperate. Riesing was a proud man, but he was not a fool. He was trapped. His men were terrified and his supplies were low. He tried to stall, sending back letters to Stuyvesant, appealing to their shared Protestant faith, demanding honorable terms and asking for a few days to deliberate. Stuyvesant, perched on the deck of his warship, was in no mood for negotiation. He returned a single cold demand: unconditional surrender. He began to tighten the noose. He sent his troops to raid the Swedish farms outside the fort, capturing settlers, seizing livestock, and burning homes. The psychological pressure was immense. Inside the fort, Swedish soldiers began to desert, climbing the walls at night to surrender to the Dutch rather than starve or be blown apart. The siege lasted for 10 agonizing days. Finally, on September 15, 1655, a defeated Johann Riesing walked out of Fort Christina under a white flag. He and Stuyvesant signed the official articles of capitulation. The conquest was over. Not a single shot had been fired in the siege. The sheer, overwhelming threat of force had been enough. The terms of surrender were a perfect reflection of the Dutch character: ruthless in war, pragmatic in peace. The Wick did not want a depopulated, useless piece of land. It wanted a productive, tax-paying one. Governor Riesing and his soldiers were to be disarmed and shipped back to Europe. The Swedish dream of a North American empire was officially dead. But for the 350-some Swedish and Finnish farmers, woodsmen and traders, the Dutch offered a simple choice: swear an oath of allegiance to the Dutch Republic, and you can keep your farms, your churches, your local courts, and your language. If you refuse, you will be considered an enemy, and your lands will be seized. Almost every single settler stayed. They were farmers, not soldiers, and their loyalty was to their land and their families, not to a distant king who had failed to protect them. In one swift, bloodless campaign, the Dutch had doubled the size of their North American claim. New Sweden was erased from the map and absorbed, becoming the South River colony of New Netherland. But the people of New Sweden, the Finns with their log cabins, the Swedes with their Lutheran churches, remained, becoming one more thread in the diverse, multicultural tapestry of the Dutch colony. This was the first conquest. It was the first time in North America that one European colony had forcibly, militarily seized and absorbed another. It set a powerful and dangerous precedent. It proved that empires in this new world were not permanent. that claims were only as good as the cannons that backed them, and in his moment of total victory, Peter Stuyvesant, the conquering hero of the Delaware, had no idea that he had just set the stage for his own downfall. In less than a decade, a far larger, more powerful fleet would sail into his harbor, and the English, who had been watching the Dutch conquest with great interest, would use his own tactics against him, bringing the Dutch-American dream to an equally forcible end. The Beaver Wars. When Dutch, French, and native allies fought for control of the fur trade. In the 17th century, the forests of North America were home to an animal that would change the course of history. It was not a creature of gold or silver, but it was in its own way more valuable. This was the beaver. Its pelt, when processed into felt, was the raw material for the fashionable waterproof hats that every person of status in Europe craved. The beaver was the oil of the 17th century, a commodity that drove nations to exploration, to settlement, and ultimately, to a new and devastating form of war. By the 1640s, two rival parallel empires had taken root, both built on this single furry commodity. To the north, the French had built their empire on the St. Lawrence River. Theirs was an empire of alliances, a vast network held together by missionaries and coureurs de bois, who paddled deep into the continent. Their primary partners were the Wendat-Huron Confederacy, who acted as the great middlemen, bringing thousands of pelts from the Great Lakes region down the Ottawa River to Montreal and Quebec. To the south, the Dutch had built their empire on the Hudson River. Theirs was an empire of commerce, a pure, profit-driven enterprise. Their primary partners were the Iroquois Confederacy, or Haudenosaunee. From their fortress-like post at Fort Orange, modern-day Albany, the Dutch had formed a lucrative, pragmatic, and world-changing alliance. This arrangement created a geographic tinderbox. The two great European powers, France and the Netherlands, were now backing two of the most powerful indigenous confederacies on the continent, the Huron and the Iroquois. They were neighbors and they were mortal enemies. A collision was not just likely, it was inevitable. The spark that lit the flame was, quite simply, an economic and ecological crisis. By 1640, the Iroquois, living in their ancestral heartland in upstate New York, had hunted their own territory bare. The beaver was gone. This was a catastrophe. Their entire way of life now depended on a steady flow of European goods. Metal knives, iron kettles, wool blankets, and, most critically, firearms. Without beaver pelts to trade, they would be cut off by their Dutch partners. They would be defenseless, poor, and vulnerable. The Iroquois were faced with a simple, brutal choice: adapt or be destroyed. They chose to adapt by force. Their strategy was bold. If they could not trap their own furs, they would seize the fur trade of their rivals. They would become the new sole middlemen. They would use their strategic position to intercept the flow of furs from the west, rerouting it from the French St. Lawrence to the Dutch Hudson. They would do this by destroying the very hub of the French system, the Huron Confederacy. But this was not just a war of economics. It was fueled by two other equally powerful forces. The first was disease. European illnesses, particularly smallpox, had ripped through the Iroquois villages, killing thousands and destabilizing their society. This leads to the second force, the mourning wars. In Iroquois culture, warfare was often a means of assuaging grief. When a person died, from disease, in battle, or by accident, the community was diminished and the spirit power of their nation weakened. To restore this balance, war parties were sent out. Their goal was not to kill, but to take captives. These captives would be brought back to the village, forced to run a gauntlet, and then either be ritually tortured to death, to feed the grief of the mourning, or, more often, be formally adopted into a family, taking the name and social role of the person who had died. Disease created mass death, which created mass grief, which created an insatiable need for captives. This created the perfect storm of violence. The Iroquois now had a desperate economic need for fur and a profound cultural need for captives. This deadly combination launched the series of conflicts we now call the Beaver Wars. The true catalyst arrived in the early 1640s. The Dutch at Fort Orange, seeing an opportunity to cripple their French rivals by proxy, made a fateful business decision. They began to sell firearms, arquebuses, muskets, powder, and lead, directly to their Iroquois partners in large quantities. This shattered the balance of power in North America. The French, by contrast, would only trade guns to indigenous people who had converted to Catholicism. The Dutch, as pragmatic capitalists, had no such rules. They sold to their best customers. Suddenly, the Iroquois were not just motivated, they were the best armed indigenous nation on the continent. In 1649, the storm broke. A massive Iroquois army, numbering over 1,000 warriors armed with Dutch muskets, bypassed the French forts and marched deep into the Huron homeland, Wendake. The result was not a battle. It was an annihilation. The Iroquois offensive was a blitzkrieg, a lightning war of total destruction. They moved from one fortified Huron village to the next, setting fire to the longhouses, slaughtering indiscriminately, and taking hundreds of captives. The Huron, armed mostly with bows, clubs, and a few French guns, stood no chance. French Jesuit missionaries who had lived among the Huron for decades were caught in the inferno. Two of them, Jean de Brébeuf and Gabriel Lalemant, were captured. They were bound to stakes and subjected to a horrific ritual torture, with the Iroquois mocking their baptism rites by pouring boiling water over their heads. By the spring of 1650, the Huron Confederacy, a nation of over 20,000 people, the breadbasket of the region, and the linchpin of the entire French Empire, was gone. It had ceased to exist. The survivors scattered in a great diaspora, fleeing for their lives. Some fled to Quebec, where they became refugees. Others fled west, attaching themselves to other tribes, eventually becoming the people known as the Wyandot. The French alliance system had completely collapsed. The Iroquois were now the masters of the fur trade, but they did not stop. Their victory had only proven the success of their tactics. For the next 20 years, the Iroquois Confederacy became the dominant and most feared military power on the continent. The 1650s and 1660s became a reign of terror for New France. Emboldened, the Iroquois pushed west, attacking other French allies, the Pétuns, the Neutral, the Erie, the Miami, and the Illinois. They emptied the Ohio Valley, driving its inhabitants out in a wave of terror. Their war parties, now flush with furs and captives, turned their full attention to the French settlements on the St. Lawrence. Life in Montreal, the settlement closest to Iroquois territory, became a waking nightmare. Settlers could not farm their fields without an armed guard. To leave the tiny fort was to risk ambush, capture, and a terrifying death. The colony of New France, cut off from its fur-trading lifeblood and under constant military assault, was on the brink of total collapse. This was the Beaver Wars, and the Dutch had played it perfectly. Without lifting a single sword themselves, their commercial policy at Fort Orange had armed a proxy force that had, in effect, shattered their rival's empire. The terror only ended when France, in a last desperate move, changed the entire nature of its colony. In 1663, King Louis XIV, the Sun King, was so appalled by the state of his colony that he dissolved the private company that ran it and took direct royal control. He declared he would make New France the jewel of his empire, and he did so by sending an army. In 1665, the Carignan-Saliers Regiment, 200 professional, uniformed French soldiers, veterans of the wars in Europe, arrived in Quebec. This was a force unlike anything North America had ever seen. Their mission was not to trade, but to destroy the Iroquois homeland. In 1666, the French army marched south into the heart of Iroquois territory in modern New York. The Iroquois, who had terrorized the continent for decades, now faced a European professional army. Their warriors, masters of the forest ambush, simply melted away, refusing to fight a pitched battle. But the French commander, the Marquis de Tracy, did not need to win a battle. He marched into their great capital villages, which were now completely empty, and there he enacted his own form of total war. He put the villages to the torch, but most importantly, he burned their food. He set fire to their vast storehouses, destroying over 1 million bushels of corn, their entire winter supply. This was a blow the Iroquois could not withstand. Facing a winter of mass starvation, they had no choice. They sued for peace. The Beaver Wars, which had raged for nearly half a century, finally subsided. The conflict would flare up again, but the French invasion had broken the Iroquois' sense of invincibility. It all culminated, decades later, in the Great Peace of Montreal in 1701, where the Iroquois, having been battered by both the French and their Western allies, finally agreed to a policy of neutrality. The legacy of the wars was profound. It had utterly redrawn the map, destroying entire nations like the Huron and scattering others across the continent. It had emptied the Ohio Valley, creating a vacuum that the English would one day seek to fill. And it had cemented the Iroquois as the dominant indigenous power. No longer a client of the Dutch or their English successors, but a sophisticated political power in their own right, masters of playing the rival European empires against each other for their own survival. The continent and the rivalries that would define it for the next 100 years had been forged in the bloody, fiery crucible of the Beaver Wars. The Southern Clash, the long-ignored border wars between Spanish Florida and French Louisiana. For much of the 17th century, the great drama of North American empires played out in the frozen north. It was a story of French coureurs de bois and Dutch merchants, of the Beaver Wars and the fiery, bloody conflict between the Iroquois and the Huron. The continent's southern rim, a humid, languid expanse of pine forests and palmetto-lined coasts, remained by contrast an afterthought. It was, by default, the undisputed territory of the Spanish crown. The Gulf of Mexico was the Spanish lake. St. Augustine, founded in 1565, guarded the Atlantic sea lanes. Santa Fe, founded in 1610, anchored the high desert. But the vast crescent-shaped coast in between, the land of modern-day Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana, was largely empty of Europeans. Spain claimed it, but it did not occupy it. There was no gold, and the native tribes were not easily conquered. Then, in 1682, a single event shattered this half-century of quiet neglect and ignited a new, forgotten border war. That event was the French design fully realized. René Robert Cavelier, Sieur de La Salle, descended the Mississippi River from the Great Lakes. At its muddy mouth, he planted a cross and claimed the entire river basin, a territory he named Louisiana, for France. This audacious claim was a geopolitical earthquake. It was a direct existential threat to the Spanish Empire. For Spain, the Mississippi River was not a highway for fur. It was a dagger pointed at the heart of New Spain. If the French controlled the mouth of this great river, they could build a port, a fortress, a back door into the continent. From there, they could raid Spanish shipping in the Gulf. Worse, they could strike overland at the one thing that mattered, the silver mines of Mexico. Spain's reaction was one of pure, unadulterated panic. The panic was catalyzed when La Salle, in 1684, returned with a fleet from France to build a colony at the mouth of his river. But La Salle, a brilliant explorer but a terrible navigator, missed the Mississippi entirely. He sailed hundreds of miles past it, landing on the coast of modern-day Texas at Matagorda Bay. There, he founded the doomed Fort St. Louis. The Spanish in Mexico heard rumors of this illegal French settlement. For the next 4 years, the Spanish government launched a frantic series of entradas, 11 separate expeditions by land and sea, to find and destroy this French dagger. It became a desperate hunt. When they finally found Fort St. Louis in 1689, they found only a ruin. The fort had been destroyed by a combination of disease, internal strife, and finally an attack by the local Karankawa people. La Salle himself had been murdered by his own men. The immediate threat was gone. But the lesson was seared into the minds of the Spanish viceroys. La Salle had failed, but the next Frenchman might succeed. The Gulf Coast, so long ignored, was now the most important and vulnerable frontier in the empire. A new race began. This time it was not for gold but for geography. The two key prizes were the two best natural harbors on the Gulf, Pensacola Bay in Florida and the mouth of the Mississippi River. Spain, jolted from its complacency, moved first. In 1698, Don Andrés de Arreola arrived with a fleet from Veracruz and formally established Presidio Santa Maria de Galve, the settlement that would become Pensacola. It was a classic Spanish outpost, underfunded, undermanned, and built of pine logs. It was not a colony of settlers. It was a military garrison of 100 soldiers, many of them convicts, sent to hold the line. They were just in time. Only 4 months later, in January 1699, a new, far more competent French fleet appeared over the horizon. It was commanded by a Canadian-born hero, Pierre Le Moyne, Sieur d'Iberville. D'Iberville was a veteran of the brutal northern wars against the English. He was tough, smart, and on a mission to finish what La Salle had started. He sailed first to Pensacola, testing the new Spanish post. The Spanish, terrified and outgunned, refused to let him enter the harbor, claiming it was unsafe. D'Iberville, an expert in reading bluffs, smiled, noted the Spanish weakness, and sailed west. He knew the Spanish were at Pensacola, which meant the grand prize, the Mississippi, was still open. In March 1699, he found it. He located the Birdfoot Delta, sailed up the Great River, and confirmed La Salle's claim. To secure the region, D'Iberville established the first French capital of Louisiana, Fort Maurepas, on the coast at Biloxi. The line was drawn. The long-ignored border war had begun. This was not a war of grand armies. It was a slow-simmering 70-year conflict fought in the humidity, mud, and pine forests of the Gulf Coast. It was fought by 3 methods: position, proxy, and smuggling. First was the war of position. The French soon found Biloxi too sandy and exposed. They moved their capital east, closer to the Spanish, to Mobile. Now the two tiny European capitals were just 60 miles apart. Spanish Pensacola and French Mobile glared at each other across the swamps. Both sides were weak, isolated, and completely dependent on supplies from the sea. Pensacola from Veracruz, Mobile from France. When those ships were late, the colonies starved. This led to the War of Proxy. Both empires, too weak to fight each other directly, tried to arm and enlist the powerful indigenous nations of the region. The French, with their long experience from Canada, proved masters of this native diplomacy. They formed a deep, lasting, and powerful alliance with the Choctaw Nation, the largest tribe in the region. The Spanish, by contrast, were clumsy. Their old mission system, which had worked in Florida with the Appalachee, failed. Their cruelty and arrogance alienated potential allies. This weakness was exploited by a third power, the English in the Carolinas, who had armed their own allies, the Creek, to conduct a massive, destructive slave trade. The Creeks, armed with English guns, effectively destroyed the Spanish mission system in Florida, pushing the Spanish back to the walls of St. Augustine and Pensacola. The southern clash thus became a three-way geopolitical chess match. The French-allied Choctaw fought the English-allied Creek, while the Spanish tried and often failed to defend themselves from both. The final and most ironic aspect of the war was smuggling. Officially, Spanish Pensacola and French Mobile were bitter rivals. Unofficially, they were each other's only lifeline. When the supply ship from Veracruz was late, the Spanish soldiers at Pensacola starved. They had only one option: sail a small boat to enemy Mobile and illegally trade Spanish silver for French flour and brandy. The French governors, also undersupplied, were happy to oblige. For decades, a massive, illicit smuggling trade kept both rival colonies alive. This strange Cold War of strategic starvation and illegal codependency finally turned hot in 1719. News arrived from Europe. Spain and France were officially at war in the War of the Quadruple Alliance. The French governor at Mobile, d'Iberville's brilliant and wily younger brother, Jean-Baptiste Lemoyne, Sieur de Bienville, saw his chance. He assembled a small force of French soldiers and, more importantly, 400 of his Choctaw allies. He marched on the ramshackle Spanish presidio at Pensacola. The Spanish governor, his garrison composed of ex-convicts who had no desire to die for Spain, surrendered almost immediately. The French flag was raised over Pensacola. The victory was short-lived. A few months later, a Spanish fleet from Havana arrived, blockaded the bay, and forced the tiny French garrison to surrender. The Spanish flag was raised over Pensacola again. Bienville, furious, gathered more troops and more Choctaw warriors. He returned, laid siege to Pensacola again, and after a bloody battle recaptured it. The French flag went up a second time. This Pensacola ping-pong perfectly illustrated the nature of the Southern War. These colonies were flimsy, pathetic outposts, playthings of sea power, which could be captured and recaptured by whichever empire currently controlled the water. The war ended in Europe in 1720. The peace treaty, in a perfect example of status quo antebellum, handed Pensacola back to Spain. Nothing, it seemed, had changed. But in reality, everything had. Bienville had learned a crucial lesson. Mobile and Biloxi were too exposed. He needed a capital that was safe, defensible, and controlled the river. Even before the war in 1718, he had begun clearing a patch of cypress swamp on a crescent-shaped bend in the Mississippi, a place the natives called Balbancha. He now moved his capital there, to the city he named New Orleans. This was the final checkmate in the long Southern clash. Spain won by keeping Pensacola, but it was a hollow victory. They were left with a tiny, starving military post at the edge of their empire. France, by founding New Orleans, had won the game. They had their safe, strategic port. They controlled the gateway to the entire Mississippi basin, the vast interior heartland of the continent. The long-ignored border war was over, not with a bang, but with a strategic repositioning. Spain was left holding a defensive, brittle shell, while France had secured the key to the future. The western frontier, Spain's desperate mission to halt French expansion into Texas. The Spanish Empire was a giant, but a giant with a soft underbelly. For over a century, its heart, New Spain, had pumped silver from the mountains of Mexico, fueling the economies of the world. To protect this heart, Spain had established two great fortresses. To the east, St. Augustine guarded the treasure fleets from English and French pirates. To the north, the high desert kingdom of Santa Fe stood as a remote, rebellious bastion. But between these 2 points lay a vast, yawning, and worthless void. This was the land the Spanish called Tejas, or Texas. It was a sprawling, ill-defined territory of piney woods, vast plains and sun-baked hills inhabited by native peoples who were, to the Spanish mind, uninteresting. They had no gold, no silver, and no great cities to plunder. For 150 years, Spain's entire policy toward Texas was to ignore it. Then, in 1685, a piece of news arrived in Mexico City that sent an electric shock of panic through the Viceroy's court. The French were here. It began with a failure. René Robert Cavelier, Sieur de La Salle, the man who had claimed all of Louisiana for France, had returned to plant a colony at the mouth of the Mississippi. He had missed. In a catastrophic error of navigation, he had overshot his target by 400 miles, landing at Matagorda Bay on the coast of modern-day Texas. He built a small, desperate outpost, Fort St. Louis, and in doing so, accidentally planted a dagger in the back door of the Spanish Empire. For the Spanish, this was the ultimate nightmare. They didn't know La Salle was lost. They didn't know his colony was a miserable failure. All they knew was that their greatest rival had bypassed all their defenses and established a base on the very doorstep of Mexico. From here, the French could rile up the native tribes, march south, and seize the silver mines that were the lifeblood of the empire. Spain's reaction was not colonization. It was a frantic, paranoid search-and-destroy mission. For 4 agonizing years, the Spanish government launched a series of entradas, 11 separate expeditions by land and sea, obsessed with finding and eliminating this French dagger. In 1689, a land expedition led by Alonso de Leon finally found it. What he discovered was not a mighty fortress, but a pathetic mud and timber ruin. It was a scene of utter desolation. The fort was in shambles, its cannons rusting. The last of the settlers had been killed by disease or the local Karankawa people. La Salle himself was long dead, murdered by his own desperate men. De Leon burned the ruins to the ground and returned to Mexico, reporting that the immediate threat was gone. But the idea of the threat remained. The French had proven that the frontier was vulnerable. The worthless land of Texas, Spain now realized, was the single most important buffer zone for protecting New Spain. The mission was no longer to ignore Texas. The mission was to hold it, to create a barrier that would halt French expansion, not with a great army, but with a new, lighter tool. The mission de Leon had been guided on his journey by Caddo people, whom the Spanish called the Tejas. He reported back, with perhaps more optimism than accuracy, that these powerful, advanced tribes were begging to be converted to Christianity. This was the solution the Crown wanted. A Spanish mission, they reasoned, was a brilliant, low-cost outpost. The friar would go where the soldier would not, and he would do the work of the empire by converting the heathen into loyal, Spanish-speaking Catholic subjects. These converted natives would become the buffer. In 1690, the first Spanish mission in East Texas, San Francisco de los Tejas, was founded. It was a total unmitigated disaster. The friars who arrived were full of religious zeal. The Caddo, however, were not interested in a new god. They were interested in guns, horses, and a military alliance against their enemies, the Apache. The Spanish offered them sermons and holy water. Then a smallpox epidemic, likely introduced by the Spanish themselves, ripped through the Caddo villages, killing thousands. The Caddo shamans blamed the mission's holy water for the deaths. When the friars began to criticize their culture and their traditions, the Caddo's patience snapped. In 1693, they told the friars to leave or be killed. The terrified priests buried their mission bells, set fire to their church, and fled back to Mexico. For the next 20 years, Spain abandoned Texas again. The experiment had failed. The frontier was empty, and then the French returned. This time they came not as a phantom menace, but as a subtle, brilliant commercial force. By the 1710s, the French were firmly established in Louisiana, with a new, struggling capital at Mobile. Their problem was simple: they had no one to trade with. Their colony was starving, and they were forbidden from trading with Spanish Mexico. In 1714, the governor of Louisiana, Antoine de la Mothe Cadillac, devised an audacious plan. He summoned a charismatic, almost mythical, French-Canadian adventurer named Louis Juchereau de Saint-Denis. Saint-Denis was the perfect man for the job. He spoke half a dozen native languages. He was fearless, and he was a master of diplomacy. His mission: to invade Texas not with an army, but with a mule train full of illegal trade goods. St. Denis crossed the entirety of Texas, found the ruins of the old Spanish mission, and then in an act of incredible audacity kept going. He didn't stop until he walked into the Spanish presidio of San Juan Bautista, on the Rio Grande, the very border of New Spain. His arrival caused a political explosion. The post commander, Capitan Diego Ramon, was stunned. A Frenchman, a real live Frenchman, had just walked out of the wilderness claiming he was looking for the Spanish to open trade. Ramon did the only thing he could. He arrested St. Denis and sent a frantic message to the viceroy in Mexico City. This second French invasion, this time by a single, charming smuggler, was even more terrifying than LaSalle's. The French were no longer on the coast. They were on the Rio Grande. While waiting for orders, St. Denis put his charm to work. He was imprisoned in the house of Capitan Ramon, where he proceeded to court, woo, and become engaged to Ramon's granddaughter Manuela. He was not just a traitor. He was a geopolitical chameleon, turning his captors into his family. When the viceroy's orders came, they were predictable. Panic. This was not a trade mission. It was a clear and present danger. Spain must reoccupy Texas immediately. A massive new expedition was organized. And this is where the story becomes a perfect farce. The Spanish needed a guide, someone who knew the route, who knew the Caddo. The only man for the job was their prisoner, the brilliant St. Denis. In a stroke of genius, St. Denis agreed. He literally helped his rivals plan their own occupation, leading the Spanish expedition back into East Texas, all to establish a market for his illegal French goods. In 1716, St. Denis guided the Spanish back to the piney woods of East Texas, where they re-established a new chain of 6 missions. This was the true permanent foundation of Spanish Texas. And to supply this remote new frontier, the expedition established a critical halfway post, a mission in Presidio on a quiet, cypress-lined river. They called it San Antonio de Valero, later the Alamo, and the Presidio de San Antonio de Bejar. The new frontier was a joke. The Spanish in East Texas were utterly isolated. Their missions were tiny, their forts were shacks, and their converts were few. They were separated from Mexico by 700 miles of wilderness and surrounded by French traders and their native allies. They only survived, ironically, by engaging in massive, illicit smuggling with the very French post of Natchitoches, Louisiana, that they were built to contain. The absurdity of this desperate mission was exposed in 1719, during the Chicken War. News arrived that France and Spain were at war in Europe. The French commander at Natchitoches, with a force of 7 soldiers, decided to conquer Texas. He marched to the nearest Spanish mission, captured it without a shot, and began to plunder the mission's livestock. As he was trying to tie a few panicked chickens to his saddle, he was thrown from his horse. The Spanish friars, seeing their chance, fled in terror. They ran all the way back to San Antonio, claiming a massive French army, hundreds strong, was invading. The panic was so complete that all of Spanish East Texas was immediately evacuated. This was the western frontier. It was a line on a map, defended by ghosts. Spain's desperate mission to halt the French had succeeded only in creating a brittle, underfunded, and completely dependent colony. It was a province built on a foundation of pure fear, a fear the French understood and, through wily smugglers like St. Denis, exploited for their own profit. Spain, in its desperation to build a wall against France, had only succeeded in creating a convenient new marketplace for their rivals. The Forgotten Legacy: How These Rival Empires Left an Indelible Mark on America. The story of America, as it is often told, is a simple, linear path. It begins in 1607 at Jamestown, or 1620 at Plymouth Rock. It's a story of English colonies, of pilgrims and Puritans, of a revolution that threw off an English king, and of a new, English-speaking nation that marched west to fulfill a manifest destiny. It is a good story, but it is profoundly incomplete. Before the 13 English colonies were a certainty, before America was anything more than a geographic expression, the continent was a chaotic, multicultural patchwork quilt of ambition. It was a place of rival empires, each with its own design for a new world, each fighting for the same vast, misunderstood prize. In the end, one by one, they all fell to the English. The Swedes were conquered by the Dutch were conquered by the English, and the French, after a global 70-year conflict, were finally and violently expelled. The English won. Their language, their laws, and their customs became the dominant framework for the new United States. Because of this victory, it is easy to dismiss the losers as historical footnotes. We see them as brief, failed experiments. A few Dutch names in New York, a Swedish log cabin, a Spanish mission in the desert. But this too is a mistake. The English victory was not an erasure. It was an absorption. The rivals were not just defeated, they were swallowed. And in the process, their cultural DNA, their ideas, their language, and their ghosts became a permanent, indelible part of the American fabric. To understand America, you must look for the forgotten legacy, the ghosts of the rivals who are not gone, but are simply and quietly everywhere. The Spanish Foundation. The Spanish were the first, and their legacy is the oldest and deepest. While English was the language of the Constitution, Spanish was the first European language spoken on the continent, and the map of the United States bears witness to this. We see this most plainly in the land itself. The entire American West and South is a Spanish-language map. Florida, the flowery land. Colorado, the red-colored river. Nevada, the snow-covered mountains. California, a name taken from a mythical Spanish novel. The cities Los Angeles, San Francisco, Santa Fe, San Antonio, St. Augustine. These are not just names. They are the title deeds of the first claim, a linguistic echo of the friars and conquistadors who walked this land a century before the Pilgrims. This is the legacy of age. St. Augustine, Florida, founded in 1565, is the oldest continuously occupied European settlement in the United States. Santa Fe, New Mexico, was founded in 1610, 10 years before the Mayflower. This simple fact reframes American history. The nation's foundations are not in the Anglo-Protestant East, but in the Hispanic Catholic South. This foundation is built into the architecture, The mission style, the adobe walls, the terracotta roofs, the rounded arches, and the central courtyards, is not just a design choice. It is a physical legacy of the presidios and missions that were Spain's tools of empire. But the most potent Spanish legacy is the one that became a Central American myth. The cowboy. This icon of American freedom and self-reliance is a direct line descendant of the Spanish vaquero. The lariat, la riata, the chaps, chaparreras, the rodeo, the ranch, the branding of cattle, the great cattle drives. All of these were Spanish and Mexican inventions, born on the arid plains of New Spain and later adopted by Anglo-Americans who came to Texas. Finally, there is the hidden legacy of Spanish law. In the wet green fields of England, English common law was born. But in the dry, arid West, that law didn't work. It was Spanish law, born in the deserts of Spain, that gave the American West its two most critical legal concepts. Prior appropriation, the first person to use water owns the rights to it, and community property, what a husband and wife acquire during their marriage belongs to them both equally. In 9 U.S. states, your marriage and your property are defined by this forgotten Spanish, not English, code. The French thread, if Spain's legacy is a fortress-like foundation, France's is a sinuous silver thread. It is the legacy of the river, of accommodation, and of a stubborn alternative vision of life. Like Spain, France left its mark on the map. But where Spain named the land, France named the water. Its empire was a 4,000-mile crescent of rivers and lakes, and the names are its epitaph. From Detroit, the Strait, and Sault Ste. Marie, the Rapids, to Des Moines, of the Monks, St. Louis, and Baton Rouge, Red Stick. This is the great inland spine of the continent. But the French design was different. The French did not conquer. They allied. They did not displace. They integrated. The coureurs des bois and their native allies created a middle ground of cultural and, crucially, genetic exchange. This legacy, the Métis, mixed-race peoples, created a different social fabric in the center of the continent, one based on kinship, not conquest. The most bizarre and lasting French legacy is in Louisiana. In a nation almost entirely defined by the English common law, Louisiana stands alone. It is the only state whose legal system is based on the French Napoleonic Code, or civil law. This is not a quaint technicality. It means that judges, not juries, are the primary investigators. It means contracts, marriage, and inheritance are handled in a way that is profoundly different from the other 49 states. It is a living legal fossil of the French design. And of course, there is the cultural heart of that design, New Orleans. It is in many ways the least American city and the most European. Its Creole culture, its food, its music, the birthplace of jazz, its architecture, and its laissez-faire attitude, let the good times roll, are a direct result of its French and later Spanish colonial past. It is a pocket of defiant, joyful resistance to the Anglo-Protestant norm, the Dutch gateway. The Dutch Empire in America was short-lived, but it was planted in the most strategic place on earth. The Dutch did not leave behind a legal code or a vast network of cities. They left behind a single world-changing idea, the gateway. When the Dutch West India Company founded New Amsterdam, they did not care about God or glory or building a city on a hill. They cared about business. They chose Manhattan Island for its magnificent deep-water harbor. They built a company town, and because they couldn't get enough Dutch to come, they opened the port to everyone. In the 1640s, it was said 18 languages were spoken in the muddy streets of New Amsterdam. This was the legacy, pragmatic pluralism. It wasn't tolerance born of high-minded ideals. It was tolerance as a business necessity. This commercial, multicultural, and fiercely ambitious DNA became the DNA of New York City. The English conquered the city, renamed it, but they never changed its core identity. The Dutch also linger in our language. Common English words like boss from the Dutch bos, cookie, kukje, stoop, stoop, Yankee, Yankees, and even Santa Claus, Sinterklaas are echoes of the Dutch gateway. The Swedish seed finally, there is the briefest, most forgotten experiment. New Sweden. Their 17-year colony on the Delaware River was a tiny flash, conquered by the Dutch and then swallowed by the English. They left no laws, no cities, no vast claims. They left one single powerful thing, the log cabin. The Swedish and Finnish settlers who came to the Delaware were woodsmen. They brought with them a building technique from their homeland, perfectly adapted to a forested pioneer world. It was a house that a single family could build with only an axe. When later waves of Scots, Irish, and German immigrants arrived, they adopted this simple, sturdy, and fast design. This Swedish seed grew into the ultimate symbol of the American frontier. It became the mythic, humble birthplace of presidents like Abraham Lincoln, the icon of American self-reliance and grit. But this most American of structures was, in fact, a forgotten gift from the rivals who lost. The English and the Americans who came after built their great house on these foundations. They took the Spanish ranch, the French rivers, the Dutch port, and the Swedish cabin, and wove them into a new national story. The rival empires are not dead. They are the invisible, indelible